Chapter 28, Steering Systems and Integral Steering Gears, Day 3, Video 8, Disassembly. Okay, so we've determined that we have to disassemble the steering axle so that we can initiate the repairs of replacing bushings and kingpins and that sort of stuff. So we need to take this axle end apart. So let's start out by removing the tie rod end from the steering knuckle. So we've got the Ackerman arm coming through here, and here we've got that tie rod end coming into and through the end of the Ackerman arm. Castellated nut with a cotter pin, so we'd bend that over, pull out the cotter pin, remove the castellated nut, and then a couple different ways that we can separate that tie rod end from the steering knuckle. Here we've got a tie rod separating fork, or a pickle fork, wedge shape, so that it goes in between here and between this tie rod and the knuckle, and then you drive it in with the hammer, and then as it progresses through, it manually or physically separates those two so that tie rod end can come apart. So you can do it that way, or another way you can do it is to take your cotter pin out, castellated nut, leave just a couple of threads, 2 or 3 threads on the end without taking the nut all the way off, and then taking your hammer or a mini sledge and hitting right on the end of that Ackerman arm. So the tie rod end, as it comes up through the end of the spindle here, it's got a tapered shaft and then a tapered hole in the end of the Ackerman arm, and it's all that surface area that causes the tie rod end to bind or to hold into the steering knuckle. So by taking your mini sledge or your hammer and striking it right on the end, okay, and it takes several hard strikes, what that will do is the impact will create a shock load and loosen that bond between the taper of the tie rod end and the tapered hole in the end of the spindle, or the Ackerman arm, and cause those to separate, so it'll drop. And that's why we've left the castellated nut just partly on there, so it doesn't fall on the floor and damage the tie rod end. One of the reasons we'll do that is because if we use a pickle fork or a tie rod fork, it's going to damage that rubber boot that holds the reservoir of oil of grease inside that tie rod end. So if we do it with the hammer, we're not going to damage that boot and potentially not damage the tie rod end. One thing we don't want to do is hammer down on the end of that rod, or the tie rod end, to try and drive it out. You'll just end up damaging threads, damaging the tie rod end, and you'll end up putting a new one on. We don't want to use heat. If it's stubborn and we can't get it apart, we don't want to use heat to try and break that bond, because the steer axle is made from tempered components, which means it's heat treated. And if we use a torch, we are going to alter that heat treating, causing it to weaken, and we don't want to do that with the steer axle components. So those are heat treated or tempered. So again, no heat for the technician to use on that. So we've got our tie rod end off, and now to pull the kingpin here, we need to push out these draw keys, and we may have one and then a second one at the opposite side going from the opposite direction. So make sure that you take a look to make sure if it's got two, that you've got them both out. So it's just a nut in a lock washer. Once you've got that out, drive that pin out the opposite way. It's got a tapered surface to it that wedges against that kingpin and keeps it located in place. And then now we can drive out or push out the kingpin so that we can separate that steering knuckle from the steering axle.